Middle-earth holds more than mountains and rivers. It carries the echoes of forgotten ages. I am your keeper of ancient knowledge, sharing the deeper lore that illuminates even the darkest mysteries. Welcome to the untold stories.
In the deep places of Fangorn, where the roots of time itself drink from springs untouched by mortal memory, there came a stirring in the year that would later be marked as the beginning of sorrows. The trees, those ancient watchers who had stood sentinel since the music of creation first rang through the halls of Arda, began to murmur in tongues not heard for many long ages of the world. It was not the gentle creaking of bough against bough that marked the turning of seasons, nor the whispered conversations that the wind carried between oak and ash, elm and beech. This was something deeper, more urgent, a trembling that ran through root and heartwood alike, as if the very bones of the earth had begun to ache with a pain too great for silence. Treebeard the Ent, oldest of the walking trees, felt it first in the hollow of his ancient trunk, where the slow-burning fire of his tree heart had glowed steady and calm for countless seasons. He stood motionless among the towering pillars of his kindred, his bark-rough hands resting upon the moss-covered stones that marked the boundaries of the Entmoot gathering place. The morning mist clung to his shoulders like the memory of dreams half forgotten, and dew collected in the deep furrows of his brow. "Hrum, hroom," he rumbled to himself, the sound rolling like distant thunder through the shadowed glades. Something is not hasty at all, yet it hurries toward us nonetheless. To the south and west, beyond the eaves of the forest where the land opened into the green expanses of Rohan, smoke rose in columns too straight and purposeful to be born of hearth-fire or forge. The wind that brought their scent carried with it the bitter tang of burning. Not the clean smoke of wood and leaf, but something fouler, tinged with the reek of torn earth and the screaming of saws through living timber. The younger trees, if any tree in Fangorn could truly be called young, swayed restlessly in the growing dawn light. Their leaves rustled with a sound like the turning of ancient pages, speaking in the old tongue of griefs that had no names in the common speech of men. They spoke of their cousins to the south, the border trees who stood guard at Fangorn's edge, and of the terrible silence that had begun to spread among their ranks like a blight. Quickbeam, swiftest of the Ents, had brought word 3 days past, though time moved differently for the tree shepherds, and 3 days might have been as long as a season in the hurried lives of smaller folk. His message was brief, as befitted one whose nature ran more swiftly than the deep patience of his kin. The trees are falling, they fall, and they do not rise again. Now, as the sun climbed higher through the canopy and sent spears of golden light down through the ancient halls of the forest, Treebeard felt the weight of decision settling upon him, like snow upon the mountains. For too long had the Ents walked only the deepest paths of their domain, tending the trees that grew in the forest's heart while the borders grew thin and vulnerable. For too long had they assumed that the troubles of the outside world would pass them by, as troubles had passed for so many ages before. But troubles, like shadows, have a way of creeping inward, and even the deepest roots must eventually taste the poison that seeps down from blighted soil. The Ent straightened to his full height, his head rising above the tallest oaks, and his voice, when it came, shook the very leaves with its depth and sorrow. "The time for hastiness," he said to the listening trees, "may have come at last." The whisper came with the evening wind, carried on breath that had traveled far across the troubled lands. It spoke not in words that men or elves might understand, but in the deeper language of sap and fiber, of rings within rings that marked the passage of countless seasons. The trees at Fangorn's edge, those brave sentinels who stood where forest met plain, brought tidings that chilled even the warm heartwood of the ancient Ents. Leaflock, most sedentary of the tree shepherds, had not moved from his chosen grove for nigh on 700 years. His feet had grown deep into the loam, and moss carpeted his shoulders like a green mantle. Yet even he stirred at the telling, his drowsy eyes opening like lanterns in the gathering dusk. "They come in the night," rustled the border trees, their voices carried inward by relay upon relay of oak and ash, birch and rowan. "They come with teeth of steel and hearts of fire. Our kindred fall beneath their blades, and where we stood, the earth lies bare and bleeding." Treebeard listened to their lament with growing sorrow, his great hands clenched into fists that could have crushed boulders. The old tongue flowed from the wounded trees like water from a broken vessel. Each word a name, each name a life extinguished. Elm children who had danced in summer breezes now lay silent. The ancient Huons who had guarded the forest secrets for millennia were being hewn down like wheat before the harvest. "Tell me," rumbled the eldest Ent, his voice carrying to every corner of the darkening wood, "tell me of those who bring this destruction." The answer came in fragments, pieced together from the testimonies of survivors, trees that had felt the axe bite but somehow endured, saplings that had hidden in shadow while their elders fell. The destroyers wore the white hand upon their shields, the mark of one who had once walked among the wise. They spoke in the harsh tongue of the Uruk-hai, yet their purpose was not random slaughter, but something more calculated, more cruel. "They seek the straight timber," whispered an ancient beech whose trunk bore the scars of near felling. "The strong wood of oak and ash, the tall spears of the pine. They strip away bark and leave the wood to rot, taking only what serves their master's purpose." Bregalad, youngest of the Ents and swiftest to anger, began to pace among the trees with steps that shook the earth. His rowan red hair whipped in the wind of his passing, and his eyes blazed like autumn fires. "Too long have we stood idle," he cried. "Too long have we let the affairs of the outside world pass us by while our people suffer." But Treebeard raised one massive hand, and even Bregalad's fury stilled at the gesture. The eldest of the shepherds stood silent for a long moment, his head tilted as if listening to voices that came from far beyond the borders of hearing. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of decision. "The trees speak truly," he said. "The time of watching and waiting draws to its close. But we are not hasty people, young Bregalad. We do not run to war as men do, with hot blood and quick blade. We are the shepherds of the trees, and our anger, when it comes, runs deeper than the roots of mountains." As if in answer to his words, a new voice joined the chorus of the forest, deep and hollow, like wind through caverns. From the very heart of Fangorn came the sound of awakening, as trees that had slept since the elder days began to stir. The Huorns, those half-awakened trees that walked the border between plant and spirit, felt the call of their shepherds and began to move. The earth trembled, leaves fell like rain, and in the gathering darkness, ancient eyes opened to look upon the world with the slow-burning fire of inevitable wrath. 3 leagues south of Fangorn's eaves, where the grass of Rohan ran green and unbroken to the horizon, a lone rider urged his horse toward the forest edge. The beast beneath him was grey as storm clouds, its mane flowing like water in the wind, and its eyes held a light that spoke of distant shores and timeless journeys. This was Shadowfax, chieftain of the Miaras, and he bore upon his back one whose very presence seemed to bend the light around him, a tall figure wrapped in grey, with a staff of white wood gleaming in his hand. Gandalf the Grey rode with purpose that burned like fire beneath his weathered exterior, though to mortal eyes, his pace might have seemed leisurely. The wizard's keen gaze swept the forest edge as he approached, noting signs that would have escaped the notice of all but the most learned in woodcraft. The trees stood too still, their branches motionless despite the wind that stirred the grass around Shadowfax's hooves. The birdsong that should have filled the morning air was absent, replaced by a silence that felt heavy with watching. "Easy, my friend," murmured Gandalf as Shadowfax snorted and tossed his head, sensing his rider's tension. "We are expected, I think." Indeed, as they drew closer to the first line of oaks, the trees themselves seemed to part before them, creating a path where none had existed moments before. Ancient trunks groaned and shifted, their roots sliding through earth like serpents, opening a way that led deeper into the forest heart. Shadowfax stepped forward without hesitation, his hooves making no sound upon the moss-carpeted ground. The wizard had ridden far to reach this place, through lands where smoke rose from burning homesteads and the marks of Uruk feet scarred the earth. Word had reached him in Rivendell of the troubles that plagued the borders of Fangorn, carried by the wind-swift birds that served as messengers to those who knew their speech. Elrond had listened with grave concern to Gandalf's tale, his ageless features creased with worry. "If Saruman moves against the Ents," the Lord of Rivendell had said, "then his corruption runs deeper than we feared. The shepherds of the trees have been allies to the wise since the elder days. They are slow to anger, but should they finally rouse to wrath..." Gandalf had nodded grimly. "Then the White Wizard has made an enemy he cannot unmake. But I fear that is precisely what he intends. Saruman knows the worth of the Ents' friendship, just as he knows the danger of their enmity. If he can provoke them to hasty action, draw them into open war before they are ready." The path through Fangorn wound ever deeper, past groves where the afternoon sunlight fell in cathedral columns through branches that had known the world when it was young. Here the air itself seemed thick with memory, heavy with the weight of ages uncounted. Shadowfax's breath misted in the cool shade, and Gandalf felt the familiar tingle that came when great powers stirred in the deep places of the world. At length, they came to a clearing where standing stones marked an ancient gathering place. The stones were older than kingdoms, carved with symbols that predated the written speech of men, and around their base the earth was worn smooth by the passing of feet, both large and small. Here Shadowfax halted without command, and Gandalf dismounted with fluid grace, despite his apparent age. "Whom, Hom?" came a voice like distant thunder, and from among the trees stepped a figure that might have been mistaken for a gnarled oak, save for the ancient eyes that gleamed with intelligence and sorrow. "A grey pilgrim comes to Fangorn. It has been long since we have seen one of the Astari in these halls," Gandalf Stormcrow. The wizard bowed deeply, his staff glinting in the filtered sunlight. "Hail and well met, Treebeard, oldest of the shepherds. I come in dark times with darker tidings, and I fear my news will bring you little joy." The Ent's great head tilted thoughtfully, leaves rustling in what might have been a sigh. "Joy has been a stranger to these woods of late, old friend. But come, let us speak of these matters at length. The trees have much to tell, and I suspect you have even more to hear. From the heights of Methedrus, where the misty mountains cast their first shadows across the plains of Rohan, the tower of Orthanc rose like a black fang against the evening sky. Once it had been a thing of beauty, the greatest work of the Númenóreans in the days when their skill in stonecraft surpassed even the dwarves. Its smooth walls caught the light of sun and moon and stars, reflecting them in patterns that spoke of harmony between earth and sky. No longer. Now the ancient tower stood wreathed in smoke and shadow, its pinnacle crowned with devices of war. The fair gardens that had once surrounded its base were torn away, replaced by pits and forges, furnaces that burned without cease, and great wheels that turned to the rhythm of countless hammers. The stone itself seemed to have changed, growing darker with each passing season, as if the very rock drank in the malice of its master and reflected it back upon the world. Gandalf gazed upon this transformation with eyes that held memory of better days, when Saruman the White had walked these halls as a friend and ally. The wizard's face was grave as stone as he stood beside Treebeard at the forest edge, looking out across the leagues that separated Fangorn from Isengard. Between them lay the valley of the Isen, where the river ran silver in the fading light, and beyond that, the ring of mountains that encircled Saruman's stronghold. "There," said Gandalf quietly, pointing with his staff toward the distant tower. "There lies the source of your people's suffering. Saruman the White, who was once the head of my order, has fallen far from the light that once guided him. He serves now a darker master, and his need for timber grows ever greater." Treebeard's eyes followed the wizard's gesture, and his expression grew troubled. Even at this distance, the Ent could sense the wrongness that clung to Orthanc like morning mist. The very air above the tower seemed to writhe and twist, heavy with the breath of countless forges and the smoke of burning wood. No birds flew there. No green thing grew within the shadow of those walls. Hom, rumbled the Ent, his voice heavy with sorrow. "I remember when that tower was fair to look upon, when Saruman was wise and his counsels brought peace to these lands. What darkness has taken hold of him, Gandalf Stormcrow?" The wizard's grip tightened upon his staff, and for a moment his grey eyes flashed with inner fire. "Pride," he said simply. "Pride and the lust for power. He seeks to become a power in his own right, to rival the Dark Lord himself. And in that seeking, he has become something other than what he was made to be." From Isengard's direction came the sound of horns, harsh and discordant, followed by the rhythmic tramping of many feet. Even across the miles that separated them from the tower, the watchers could see the lines of torches moving like fiery serpents along the roads that led from Orthanc. Uruk-hai in their thousands, armed with blade and axe, marching to some purpose known only to their master. "His armies grow," continued Gandalf, his voice grim. "Day and night his forges burn, and from their fires come weapons of war. He breeds Uruks in the caverns beneath Orthanc, creatures of malice and fury that know neither pity nor fear. And for all this work of war he needs timber, strong wood for spear shafts and shield boards, fuel for his furnaces, supports for his tunnels. He looks upon Fangorn and sees only resources to be harvested." The ancient Ent was silent for a long while, his deep eyes fixed upon the distant tower. Around them, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for words that would shape the course of days to come. When Treebeard finally spoke, his voice carried a finality that made the very leaves tremble. "Then he shall learn," said the shepherd of the trees, "that some things are not so easily harvested. The trees of Fangorn have stood since the world was young, and they will not fall without payment in kind." A wind arose from the forest depths, carrying with it the sound of creaking wood and rustling leaves. But beneath that familiar music lay something else, something that spoke of awakening anger and ancient power stirring to wakefulness. The Huorns were moving, and their dreams were no longer peaceful. The borders of Isengard stretched beyond the walls of Orthanc itself, reaching out with tentacles of devastation that scarred the once fair valley. Where green meadows had bloomed in years past, now lay a wasteland of stumps and ash, broken stone and poisoned streams. The very earth seemed to recoil from the touch of Saruman's power, as if the land itself knew that something profane had been wrought upon its surface. Gandalf and Treebeard moved through this desolation in the grey hour before dawn, when shadows lay deepest and the watching eyes of Isengard's sentries were heavy with the weight of long vigil. The wizard had cloaked himself and his companion in concealment, drawing upon arts learned in the hidden halls of Valinor, but their passage was not entirely secret. The trees that remained, twisted now and blackened, their sap turned bitter with corruption, whispered warnings to their ancient shepherd, speaking in voices cracked with pain. "See how they suffer," murmured Treebeard, his great hand resting gently upon the trunk of an oak that had once stood proud and tall. Now the tree was little more than a skeletal frame, its branches bare of leaf, its bark scarred by the passage of countless axe blades. Yet still it lived, clinging to existence with the stubborn endurance of its kind. See how they cry out for vengeance that may never come. The oak shuddered beneath the Ents' touch, and from its wounded trunk came a sound like weeping, the lament of one who has witnessed the destruction of all that was dear. Its roots still reached deep into the earth, drawing what sustenance they could from soil grown thin and bitter, but its crown reached toward a sky heavy with smoke and shadow. They passed deeper into the waste, following paths that wound between great pits where the earth had been torn open like wounds. In these excavations, Uruk-hai labored under the lash of their overseers, digging deeper into the bones of the earth. The sound of their pickaxes rang like broken bells in the pre-dawn air, and the reek of their presence fouled the wind. These were not the crude orcs of the mountains, but something worse. Creatures bred in darkness for purposes of war, their hides thick and their muscles corded with unnatural strength. From the depths of one such pit came the sound of machinery. Great wheels turning, chains rattling, and beneath it all a low humming that seemed to vibrate in the very stones. Gandalf gestured for silence and crept to the pit's edge, peering down into the excavation. What he saw there made his face grow grim. "Engines of war," he whispered to Treebeard. "He builds machines for the breaking of walls and the burning of cities. And look there." He pointed to a section of the pit where massive wooden beams were being lowered into place. "He uses the heartwood of Fangorn's children to power his devices of destruction." The Ent's eyes blazed with sudden fury as he recognized the grain and color of the timber. These were no common trees that had fallen to Saruman's axes, but ancient giants that had stood in Fangorn's deepest groves. Their wood had been shaped and carved, fitted with bands of iron and wheels of steel, transformed from living guardians into instruments of war. "Eldest of the elder trees," breathed Treebeard, his voice thick with grief and rage. "Beechbone the golden, who remembered the first sunrise. Oakenshield the mighty, who had weathered 10,000 storms. They have made them into weapons, Gandalf Stormcrow. They have defiled the very essence of what they were." The wizard placed a restraining hand upon the Ent's arm, feeling the tremor of barely contained wrath that ran through the ancient being's frame. "Peace, old friend. Your anger is just, but this is not the time for vengeance. We came to see, to learn, to understand the fullness of what we face. When the time comes for action, it must be with wisdom as well as strength." But even as he spoke these words of caution, Gandalf felt his own anger kindling. The corruption of Saruman ran deeper than he had feared, extending beyond mere alliance with Shadow into something that twisted the very foundations of the natural world. The trees of Fangorn were more than timber. They were living beings, guardians and keepers of ancient wisdom. To see them perverted into engines of destruction was an abomination that cried out for redress. A horn sounded from the direction of Orthanc, long and mournful, and the Uruks in the pit began to climb toward the surface. The working day was ending, and soon the wasteland would crawl with patrols. It was time to depart, to carry their dark knowledge back to Fangorn and prepare for what must come. In a grove that lay hidden deep within Fangorn's heart, where the eldest trees wove their branches into a living cathedral, Gandalf and Treebeard found one who had paid the ultimate price for defying Saruman's will. The grove itself was ancient beyond reckoning, its floor carpeted with the fallen leaves of centuries, and at its center stood a circle of standing stones that predated even the awakening of the Ents. Bound to the greatest of these stones with chains of black iron was a figure that might once have been mighty, an Ent whose bark had been stripped away in places, whose limbs bore the scars of terrible torment. This was Finglas, called Leaflock by his kindred, one of the eldest of the shepherds who had grown sleepy and root-bound in the deep woods. Yet now his drowsiness was broken by pain, and his ancient eyes burned with the fire of one who has seen too much. "Leaflock," cried Treebeard, his voice breaking like thunder across still water. "How came you to this place? Your grove lies many leagues to the south, and you have not walked abroad for 700 years. The bound Ent raised his head with effort, his features twisted by suffering, but his spirit unbroken. When he spoke, his voice was like wind through dead leaves, dry and rustling with the weight of terrible knowledge. "Whom? Hom," he rasped. "They came in the night, the white wizard's servants, not Uruks alone, but men who have forgotten their kinship with growing things. They burned the borders of my grove, drove out the creatures who sheltered there, and when I rose to defend my charges..." He gestured weakly at the chains that bound him. "Iron that has been blessed with malice, forged in fires fed with the bones of trees. I cannot break free, old friend." Gandalf stepped forward, his staff glowing with soft radiance as he examined the bonds that held the Ent. The iron was indeed of strange make, dark as midnight, yet shot through with veins of sickly light. As the wizard's power touched the metal, it hissed and steamed, but did not break. Whatever craft had forged these chains, it was beyond the quick unmaking of grey magic. "This is Saruman's work," said Gandalf grimly. "He has learned much in his long study of the arts, and not all his knowledge has been turned to righteous purpose. These bonds were made specifically to hold one of your kind, Leaflock. You were brought here not as prisoner, but as bait." Treebeard's eyes narrowed to burning slits. "Bait? For what purpose?" It was Leaflock himself who answered, his voice growing stronger as anger kindled in his ancient heart. "He seeks to draw forth the Huorns from their deep forests, to make them reveal themselves in rescue of their shepherd. The White Wizard knows that the half-awakened trees are the true strength of Fangorn, more numerous than the Ents, swifter to move when roused to wrath. If he could locate their heartwood sanctuaries, he could strike at them before they could fully wake," finished Gandalf. "Saruman plays a deeper game than mere timber gathering. He seeks to cripple Fangorn's defenses before launching his greater assault." The grove around them seemed to darken at these words, as if the very trees recoiled from the implications. In the depths of Fangorn, ancient powers stirred uneasily, sensing through root and branch that their greatest secrets were under threat. The Huorns were indeed the forest's hidden strength, trees that had gained a measure of awareness and mobility, neither fully awakened like the Ents, nor completely bound to root and soil like their sleeping kindred. "Then we must not give him what he seeks," said Treebeard firmly. "Leaflock, my old friend, can you endure these bonds a while longer? If we can make Saruman believe his trap has failed." The imprisoned Ent managed something that might have been a smile, though his bark-covered features made such expressions difficult to read. "I have stood in one place for 7 centuries, Treebeard. I can wait a little longer if it serves the greater good. But know this, the White Wizard's plans run deeper still. He spoke to me of weapons that could burn even the Huorn's heartwood, of poisons that could corrupt the very roots of the earth. His war against us is more than axes and fire." Gandalf nodded grimly, his weathered face creased with concern. "Then we must be more than trees and Ents in our response. The time has come to wake powers that have slept since the Elder Days, to call upon alliances that stretch back to the music of creation itself." In the canopy above, the leaves began to whisper in the old tongue, carrying word of the grove's dark revelations to every corner of Fangorn. The trees themselves became messengers, spreading the tale through interconnected root and branch until every growing thing in the forest knew of Saruman's treachery. And in that knowing, something vast and patient began to stir. Not the quick anger of mortals, but the slow, inexorable wrath of the earth itself. The voice came to them on the wind that blew from Isengard, carried on breath that reeked of forge fire and corruption. It was not the harsh gabble of Uruk-hai, nor the crude shouting of their overseers, but something far more dangerous, the measured tones of one who had once walked among the wise, now turned to purposes of shadow. Saruman's voice had always been his greatest weapon, more potent than sword or spell. In the days of his glory, it could soothe the angry, convince the doubtful, and turn enemies into allies with nothing more than perfectly chosen words. Now that same voice had become a thing of malice, its beauty made terrible by the corruption of its speaker's heart. "Come forth, shepherds of the trees," the voice called across the leagues that separated Fangorn from Orthanc. It seemed to speak from the very air around them, as if the wind itself had been bent to Saruman's will. "Come forth and let us speak of the future that awaits your people." Treebeard stood rigid in the grove where Leaflock remained bound, his ancient features carved from stone. The other Ents who had gathered at Gandalf's summons, Quickbeam and Bregalad, Old Finglas and young Dermot, all felt the pull of that voice, the subtle compulsion that lay beneath its honeyed words. Even the trees themselves seemed to lean toward the sound, their branches bending as if drawn by invisible chains. "Do not listen," warned Gandalf, his staff blazing with sudden light. His voice has been made into a weapon, honed by years of study in the arts of persuasion and command. He seeks to divide you, to make you doubt your own hearts and purposes. But the voice continued, growing stronger with each word, until it seemed to fill the very air around them. "You call me traitor, yet what have I done but acknowledge the truth that you refuse to see? The age of trees is ending, old ones. The time of growing things draws to its close, and a new age dawns, an age of order, of purpose, of progress. I offer you a place in this new world, a chance to serve a cause greater than your own small concerns." Quickbeam the Ent snarled, his rowan red hair bristling with fury. "Serve? We are not servants, White Wizard. We are the shepherds of the trees, guardians of the growing world since its youth." "Guardians of what?" came Saruman's mocking reply. "Look around you, hasty one. See how your charges dwindle with each passing age. The great forests that once covered all the lands have shrunk to scattered groves. Men multiply while trees diminish, and their axes bite deeper with each generation. How long can you hold back the tide of change? How long before even Fangorn falls to axe and fire?" The words struck deep, for they held a kernel of truth that none could deny. The forests of Middle-earth had indeed diminished since the Elder Days, pushed back by the expanding settlements of men and dwarves. Even the Ents themselves had grown fewer, their kind slowly passing into legend as the world changed around them. "I offer you survival," continued the voice, "sweet as honey, yet bitter as gall. Join with me, and your people need not perish. I have need of guardians for my new forests, plantations that will serve the purposes of order and industry. Your trees will live, though they may serve a different master." It was then that Leaflock spoke, his voice carrying, despite the chains that bound him. "Trees in cages," he said, each word like the fall of a great stone. "Forests of slaves, this is what he offers us, brothers. Existence without freedom, life without purpose, save to serve his will." Treebeard nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing like ice in winter. "The voice of Saruman speaks fair words," he rumbled, "but beneath them lies only the desire to possess and control. We have heard his offer, and we have weighed it in the balance of our hearts. Now hear our answer, Curunir the White." The eldest Ent straightened to his full height, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the miles with the force of an avalanche. "The Ents of Fangorn do not bow to tyranny, whether it comes wrapped in fair words or not. We choose the old path, the path of guardianship without reward, of service without expectation of gain. Your new age may dawn, wizard, but it will find us standing against it, roots deep and branches high. A sound came from the direction of Isengard then. Not words, but something deeper and more terrible. It was the sound of rage barely contained, of pride wounded beyond endurance. Saruman's voice, when it came again, had lost all pretense of sweetness. "So be it," he snarled. "You have chosen your fate, tree herders. When my armies march, they will carry fire as well as blade. We shall see how long your ancient wood can stand against the new ways of war." The voice faded then, leaving only the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant sound of war drums from Orthanc. But its echo lingered in the grove, a promise of destruction that made even the mightiest oaks tremble in their roots. The attack came 3 nights later, when the moon was dark and the stars were veiled by clouds. From the direction of Isengard came a red glow that painted the underside of the sky like blood, and with it the sound of marching feet and the harsh cries of Uruk-hai. But these were not the crude raiders who had plagued Fangorn's borders in recent months. This was an army, disciplined and terrible, armed with weapons of fire and destruction. Gandalf stood upon the highest hill within Fangorn's borders, his white staff raised against the night sky. The wizard had cast aside his grey robes in the hour of greatest need, revealing the true light that had always burned within him. His hair and beard blazed silver white in the darkness, and his eyes held the fire of ancient stars. This was Gandalf the White, mightiest of the Istari, and the time for concealment was past. "Come then," he cried, his voice ringing across the forest like a trumpet call. "Come, servants of shadow, you shall find Fangorn's defenders ready to meet you." The first of the Uruk-hai emerged from the tree line, their torches guttering in the wind. They carried weapons unlike any that had been seen in Middle-earth before. Tubes of metal that vomited fire, containers that burst into cleansing flame when broken, great engines that could hurl burning missiles into the highest branches. Saruman had indeed prepared for war against the trees, and his preparations were thorough. But as the Uruks advanced into the forest, they found their path blocked by defenders more terrible than any they had faced. The trees themselves had awakened to war, and Fangorn had become a place of living nightmare for those who came with destructive intent. Ancient oaks swung branches like massive clubs, their bark thick enough to turn aside the keenest blade. Rowan trees bent low to entangle the feet of passing enemies, while their berries burst with acidic sap that burned through armor and flesh alike. From the deeper woods came the horns, those half-awakened trees that could walk when need drove them. They moved like a forest on the march, their roots tearing free from earth that released them willingly, their branches reaching out to grasp and crush any who stood in their path. These were no longer the gentle shepherds of forest glades, but warriors ancient and terrible, awakened to righteous wrath. Treebeard himself strode through the battle like a giant from the elder days, his great hands seizing Uruks and flinging them aside like broken toys. The iron weapons of Saruman's servants could wound his bark but could not stop him, and with each step he took, the earth itself seemed to rise up to aid him. Roots burst from the ground to trip his enemies, while stones rolled beneath their feet and branches fell from above to strike them down. Yet the Uruks pressed forward, driven by the will of their master and armed with weapons of terrible power. They set fires wherever they could, great blazes that climbed into the canopy and spread from tree to tree. The screams of burning wood filled the night air, a sound that cut into the hearts of every Ent like sharpest steel. For each tree that burned was not merely timber destroyed, but a life ended, a voice silenced forever. It was then that Gandalf revealed the true extent of his power. Raising his staff high, he spoke words in the ancient tongue that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the music of creation. The very air around him began to glow with white fire, and from his position on the hilltop, bolts of pure light lanced down to strike the fire engines of the enemy. "I am Gandalf the White," he proclaimed, his voice carrying over the sounds of battle. "I am the servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor. Dark fire will not avail you, servants of Udun." The white fire of his staff met the red flames of Saruman's weapons, and where they touched, the enemy's fire was quenched. But the wizard's power was not infinite, and even as he struck down one engine of destruction, two more took its place. The battle hung in the balance, tree defenders against firebearers, ancient wood against the new ways of war. It was Quickbeam who turned the tide. The swiftest of the Ents had circled wide around the battle, leading a company of horns through hidden paths to strike at the enemy's rear. They fell upon the Uruk supply lines like an avalanche, destroying the fuel and ammunition that fed Saruman's fire weapons. Without the means to sustain their burning assault, the Uruks found themselves fighting a losing battle against enemies who could not be discouraged by mere steel and flame. The rout, when it came, was swift and terrible. The surviving Uruks fled back toward Isengard, pursued by horns whose anger burned hotter than any fire. Few of Saruman's army reached the safety of their master's walls, and those who did brought word of a defeat so complete that even the White Wizard's pride was shaken. In the aftermath, as dawn broke grey and cold over Fangorn's borders, the true cost of the night's work became clear. Whole groves lay blackened and ruined there, ancient guardians reduced to ash and charcoal. The very earth was scarred by fire and battle, and it would be long years before the forest healed from these wounds. But Fangorn endured. The heart of the wood remained unbroken, and its defenders had learned the measure of their enemy's strength. War had come to the ancient forest, but the trees had not fallen unavenged. The summoning came as the first snows of winter began to fall upon the peaks of the misty mountains. Birds of strange beauty appeared at the borders of Fangorn, eagles with feathers like starlight, ravens whose voices carried words in the ancient tongue, and small songbirds that spoke with the authority of the White Council. Their message was simple and urgent. The wise were gathering, and the time had come for great decisions. Gandalf departed Fangorn as he had arrived, mounted upon Shadowfax and cloaked in purpose that burned like hidden fire. The roads to Rivendell were treacherous in winter, made more dangerous by the scattered remnants of Saruman's defeated army. But the White Wizard rode without fear. Behind him, he left the forest girding itself for greater conflicts to come, while ahead lay the hidden valley where Elrond Half-Elven held court in halls that had weathered the rise and fall of kingdoms. The last homely house stood unchanged by the passage of seasons, its walls warm with golden light that defied the winter cold. In the great council chamber, the mighty of Middle-earth had gathered. Elrond himself, master of the house and keeper of Vilya, Círdan the shipwright, oldest of the elves who remained in mortal lands, Galadriel the Golden, Lady of Lorien, whose ring Nenya gave her sight beyond the boundaries of time, and others whose wisdom stretched back to the elder days. Yet when Gandalf entered the chamber, still travel-stained from his journey, he brought with him news that troubled even these ancient counselors. The tale of Saruman's corruption, of his alliance with darker powers, and his war upon the trees of Fangorn fell upon the assembly like a shadow across the sun. "This is worse than we feared," said Elrond, his ageless features creased with concern. "If Saruman has indeed turned to the shadow, then we face enemies on two fronts. The Dark Lord stirs in Mordor, while one who was our ally controls Isengard and commands the Gap of Rohan." Círdan nodded gravely, his grey beard flowing like water over robes that seemed woven from sea foam and starlight. The corruption spread swifter than we anticipated. First, Radagast withdrew from the councils of the wise, turning his attention to birds and beasts, while greater matters demanded action. Now Saruman reveals his true nature, and we are left with only one of the Istari who remains true to his mission. "Yet the Ents fight back," said Gandalf firmly. "The trees of Fangorn will not yield easily to axe and fire. Treebeard and his people have awakened to the danger, and their wrath, once roused, is a force that even Saruman will find difficult to overcome. They buy us time to prepare our own defenses, time to marshal the free peoples for the war that must come. It was Galadriel who spoke then, her voice like music heard across still water. Time is indeed precious, Mithrandir, but it may be shorter than you know. My sight reaches far, and I see storm clouds gathering in the east. The eye turns its gaze toward the borders of Gondor, and the 9 riders wake from their long slumber. The ring has stirred, and with it all the powers of darkness. A silence fell over the chamber at these words, heavy with the weight of prophecy and doom. The ring, the one ring of power that was thought lost beneath the waters of Anduin, had indeed awakened, though its location remained hidden. Its stirring was like a bell tolling across the unseen world, calling to every servant of the shadow and setting in motion events that would reshape the fate of Middle-earth. "Then we must act swiftly," said Elrond. "The defenses of Rivendell and Lorien must be strengthened, and word must be sent to all who might aid us. The dwarves of Erebor, the men of Gondor and Rohan, even the scattered Dunedain, all must be warned of what comes." "And the Ents?" asked Círdan. "What role will the tree shepherds play in the trials ahead?" Gandalf smiled grimly, his eyes reflecting the wisdom gained through long communion with the forest dwellers. "The Ents will do what they have always done. They will guard the growing things of the world against those who would destroy them. But their anger, once fully roused, may accomplish more than armies of men. Saruman's war upon Fangorn may prove to be his greatest mistake." The council continued through the night and into the following day, as plans were made and messages prepared. Riders would carry word to the kingdoms of men, while swift birds would bear tidings to the halls of Thranduil and the mines of the Lonely Mountain. The free peoples of Middle-earth would be warned, and those who had the strength to fight would be called upon to stand against the darkness. But as the White Council made its preparations, other powers were stirring in the deep places of the world. In Fangorn, the Ents prepared for a war unlike any they had fought before. In Isengard, Saruman's forges burned ever brighter as he shaped weapons for the conquest of his enemies. And somewhere in the wilds between the Shire and Rivendell, a small creature carried a burden that would determine the fate of all. The pieces were moving on the great board of Middle-earth, and the time of testing was at hand. The ravens came first, black-winged messengers that spoke in the harsh tongue of the mountains. They brought word from the Lonely Mountain, where Dain Ironfoot ruled the kingdom under the mountain, with the wisdom of long years and the strength of Durin's folk. The message they carried was brief, but significant. The dwarves would remember their debts, and the friendship forged in fire beneath Erebor would not be forgotten when the test came. Gandalf received this news in the halls of Rivendell, where he had remained through the turning of the season to plan the great works that lay ahead. The wizard's mind was heavy with the weight of approaching war, but he found comfort in the knowledge that the sturdy folk of the mountains would stand with the free peoples when battle came. The dwarves' skill in crafting weapons and armor was without equal, and their courage in defending their halls was legendary throughout Middle-earth. "Dain remembers his oath," said Gandalf to Elrond as they walked in the gardens of Rivendell, where winter flowers bloomed in defiance of the snow that crowned the nearby peaks. "The dwarves will aid us, and their axes will sing in harmony with the voices of the Ents when Saruman's power is broken." The Lord of Rivendell nodded thoughtfully, his keen eyes fixed upon the road that wound down from the passes of the Misty Mountains. "The friendship of the dwarves is a precious thing, not lightly given nor easily broken. But I sense there is more to your plans than the forging of weapons and the sharpening of blades." Indeed, Gandalf's thoughts ranged far beyond the immediate needs of war. In his mind, he saw the greater pattern that connected all the scattered threads of resistance to the shadow, the courage of small folk and the wisdom of the mighty, the strength of stone and the endurance of growing things. The Ents of Fangorn were but one note in a symphony of defiance that must be orchestrated with care lest the harmony be lost in discord. "The dwarves have long memories," said the wizard, "and they recall not only debts of friendship, but debts of blood. Smaug the Golden brought ruin to their halls, and though the dragon is dead, the scars he left upon both stone and spirit remain. They know the price of letting evil grow unchecked, of assuming that distant threats will remain distant forever." From the north came other news as well, carried by the swift horses of the Rohirrim and the wind riders of the Beornings. King Theoden of Rohan was old and weary, his mind clouded by the whispers of a counsellor whose loyalty was suspect. But the young lords of the Mark remained true to the ancient alliance with Gondor, and their spears would ride when the call came, regardless of their king's hesitation. The Beornings, those shapeshifters who guarded the passes of the Misty Mountains, sent word that the orcs of the high places were stirring with unusual purpose. Something has set them in motion, driving them from their mountain fastnesses toward the valleys below. Their movements suggested coordination, as if a guiding intelligence directed their actions from afar. "Saruman's reach extends far," mused Gandalf as he read these reports. "He has made alliance not only with the Dark Lord in Mordor, but with every petty chieftain and bandit captain who might serve his cause. The net he weaves encompasses much of northern Middle-earth. Yet for every thread in Saruman's web, Gandalf sought to weave a stronger strand of resistance. Messages flew north to the Grey Havens, where Tírdan the shipwright commanded fleets that could carry aid wherever the sea roads led. Riders carried word to the scattered settlements of the Dúnedain, those rangers who watched the borders of civilization and kept safe the roads that honest folk traveled. Most importantly, the wizard's thoughts turned toward a small corner of the world that most of the mighty overlooked, the Shire, where the hobbits lived their quiet lives in blissful ignorance of the great affairs that shaped the world beyond their borders. It was there that the greatest hope lay, though wrapped in such humility that few would recognize its worth. "In the smallest hands," Gandalf murmured to himself as he gazed westward toward the distant hills of the Shire. "The greatest fates are often held." The wizard's plans were taking shape, as complex and interconnected as the root systems that bound together the trees of Fangorn. Each alliance forged, each message sent, each promise given and received, all were part of a greater design that would either save Middle-earth from the shadow or see it fall into darkness deeper than any that had come before. In Fangorn, the Ents felt the stirring of these distant preparations, and their ancient hearts took comfort from the knowledge that they would not stand alone. The trees whispered of armies gathering and alliances forming, of courage kindling in the most unlikely places, and hope taking root where despair had once flourished. The great game was afoot, and though the outcome remained hidden behind veils of time and chance, the pieces were moving into position for the final confrontation between light and shadow. In the green country of the Shire, where the Brandywine flowed lazy and brown through meadows thick with clover, Bilbo Baggins tended his garden with the careful attention of one who finds profound joy in simple things. The old hobbit's hands, though gnarled with age, moved with sure precision among the rows of beans and turnips, carrots and potatoes that would see him through another winter in Bag End. It had been many years since Bilbo's return from his great adventure, the journey that had taken a comfortable hobbit from his well-appointed home and transformed him into something both more and less than he had been before. The neighbours of Hobbiton still spoke of it in hushed whispers, as if the very mention of dragons and dwarves might somehow disturb the peaceful order of their lives. But Bilbo remembered. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the smoke rose straight from his chimney and the dew lay thick upon the grass, he would sit in his study and turn over memories like precious stones. The lonely mountain crowned with fire, the riddles spoken in darkness beneath the misty mountains, the ring that had come to him by chance and remained with him by choice. All these things lived still in the chambers of his heart. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the leaves of the party tree in shades of gold and crimson, an unexpected visitor appeared at Bilbo's green door. The knock was neither heavy nor urgent, but it carried with it the weight of authority that made the old hobbit set aside his second breakfast and hasten to answer. "Gandalf," cried Bilbo, his face lighting with genuine joy as he beheld the wizard upon his doorstep. "What a pleasant surprise! Though I must say, you look rather more luminous than when I saw you last." Indeed, the change in Gandalf was remarkable. Where once he had worn grey robes and carried a staff of ashwood, now he was clad in white that seemed to glow with inner light, and his staff was wrought of material that might have fallen from the stars themselves. Yet his eyes were the same, kind and ancient, touched with humour but shadowed by knowledge of sorrows yet to come. "May I come in, old friend?" asked the wizard. "I have much to tell you, and I fear my news will bring you little comfort." They sat by the fire in Bilbo's cosy parlour, sharing pipeweed and tea while outside the wind rustled through the leaves of late autumn. The hobbit listened with growing concern as Gandalf spoke of Saruman's betrayal, of the war that had come to Fangorn Forest, and of the greater darkness that stirred in the east. "War," said Bilbo thoughtfully, blowing a smoke ring that hung in the air like a grey crown. "I had hoped that such things were behind us, that the death of Smaug had ended the need for heroics and adventures. Yet it seems the world has not finished with either of us." Gandalf studied his old friend with eyes that seemed to peer into the very depths of his soul. "The world changes, Bilbo, and rarely for the better. The peace you have known here in the Shire is precious beyond measure, but it cannot last forever. Even now, forces move that will reach into every corner of Middle-earth before they are spent." The old hobbit was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently turning the golden ring that hung upon a chain about his neck. It was a simple thing to look upon, unmarked by any device or inscription, yet Gandalf's gaze lingered upon it with an intensity that made Bilbo uneasy. "You speak of forces and powers," said Bilbo at last, "but what has an old hobbit to do with such great matters? I am not the adventurer I once was, Gandalf. My bones creak like old doors, and my sword has grown rust in its sheath. Whatever service I might have rendered, surely those days are past." "Perhaps," said the wizard gently, "yet the greatest services are not always those that shine like silver in the sight of kings and lords. Sometimes the most important deeds are done by those who seek no glory, who act not from duty or honor, but from simple love of what is good and growing in the world." As if summoned by these words, there came the sound of young voices from the garden path, hobbits returning from their morning errands in Hobbiton. Bilbo rose and peered through his round window, watching as his young cousin Frodo made his way up the hill toward Bag End, his arms full of packages from the market. "Frodo," murmured Bilbo, and something in his voice made Gandalf lean forward intently. "A good lad, though he has the same restless spirit that once plagued me. Sometimes I catch him staring westward toward the Blue Mountains, as if he can see beyond the borders of the Shire to lands that call to something in his blood." The wizard nodded slowly, his mind working through possibilities and probabilities, weighing choices that would affect not only the life of one young hobbit, but the fate of all Middle-earth. "Tell me of this Frodo," he said. "What manner of hobbit is he? Does he possess courage to match his restless spirit?" "Courage," Bilbo laughed, but it was not a sound of mockery. He dove into the Brandywine to save young Merry Brandybuck from drowning, though he was barely more than a lad himself. He stands up to the Sackville Bagginses when they tried to bully the smaller folk of Hobbiton. Yes, I think he has courage enough, though he would be the last to claim it. Outside, Frodo's voice could be heard calling a greeting to someone on the path, cheerful and untroubled. The sound made both hobbit and wizard fall silent, each lost in thoughts of the burden that such innocence might one day be called upon to bear. "The road ahead is dark," said Gandalf at last, "and I cannot see clearly where it leads. But I begin to think that hope may yet be found in the most unexpected places." The great plan began to take shape in the halls of Bag End, though its true scope was hidden even from those who helped to weave its threads. Gandalf remained in the Shire for many days after his arrival, walking the green paths of Hobbiton and speaking quietly with those whose courage might prove crucial in the trials ahead. Yet he moved carefully, revealing only what was necessary, for the safety of the Shire depended upon its continued obscurity. To most who saw him, the wizard appeared merely to be renewing old friendships and taking pleasure in the simple joys of hobbit life. He smoked pipes with the gaffer outside the Green Dragon, shared tales with the children who gathered around his feet wherever he walked, and sampled ales and cakes with the enthusiasm of one who had been too long away from such comforts. But to those with eyes to see, Gandalf's true purpose was clear. He was taking the measure of the Shire's hidden strength, identifying those who might rise to greatness when the need arose. The hobbits possessed virtues that the great and mighty often overlooked: a stubborn courage that endured when flashier bravery failed, a loyalty that ran deeper than oaths sworn in halls of stone, and a love of simple goodness that no shadow could entirely quench. In the Betrayal evenings, when the stars came out above the hill of Hobbiton, Gandalf would sit with Bilbo before the fire and speak of matters that touched the edges of the great plan. Maps were consulted, ancient charts that showed the hidden ways between the kingdoms of Middle-earth, roads that were known only to the wise and those who traveled beyond the boundaries of civilized lands. "The paths of the dead," murmured Bilbo, tracing with one finger a route that wound through the White Mountains south of Rohan. "I remembered tales of that road from my adventure with the dwarves. They said no living man could walk it and return unchanged." "Perhaps," said Gandalf thoughtfully, "yet there are some who are not living men, and others who care little for change if it serves a righteous purpose. The oath-breakers who haunt that path have debts that may yet be called due, if one could be found with the authority to demand payment." They spoke too of Rohan, where King Theoden grew ever more withdrawn from the affairs of his kingdom, leaving the governance to a councillor whose name was Wormtongue and whose loyalty was suspect. The Riders of the Mark would be crucial in any war against Isengard, for they alone possessed the speed and skill to counter the Uruk-hai's superior numbers and equipment. "The young lords of Rohan remember their oaths," said Gandalf. "Eomer, son of Eomund, nephew to the king, leads the Riders of the Eastmark with wisdom beyond his years. When the time comes, he will answer the call, regardless of what his uncle's counselor might whisper." But it was of Gondor that they spoke most often, for that ancient kingdom stood as the great bulwark against the shadow, its white towers and strong walls the final defense of the West. Yet Gondor too was troubled. The line of kings had failed, and the realm was ruled by stewards whose wisdom was great but whose authority was questioned by many. "Denethor, son of Ecdalion, sits upon the throne of the stewards," said Gandalf, his voice heavy with concern. "He is a man of great pride and greater sorrow, for the burden of ruling Gondor in its hour of need has bent his spirit near to breaking. Yet he remains steadfast in his duty, and the city of Minas Tirith will not fall while he draws breath." As the nights grew longer and the first snows dusted the hills of the Shire, word came from distant lands that the great plan was indeed taking shape. Ravens brought news from the north, where the dwarves of Erebor had begun forging weapons in quantities not seen since the great armories of Khazad-dûm were in their glory. From the Grey Havens came ships bearing warriors from across the sea, elves who had answered the call of Gil-galad's heir and come to stand beside their ancient allies. Most significantly, riders in grey brought word from Fangorn Forest, where the Ents had completed their great deliberation. Treebeard's message was brief but momentous. The shepherds of the trees will march to war. Let Saruman the Destroyer count the cost of his treachery. So it begins, said Gandalf as he read the Ents' words by the light of Bilbo's fire. The pieces move upon the board, and the great game enters its final phase. Yet still, the most crucial element remains hidden, and upon its discovery may hang the fate of all our endeavors. Bilbo looked up from his own reading, a book of old tales that spoke of rings and their powers, and met the wizard's gaze with eyes that held deeper understanding than his simple words revealed. This crucial element, he said quietly, does it by any chance involve a certain golden ring that has long rested in my keeping? The wizard's smile was both sad and proud. You have always been wiser than you appeared, old friend. Yes, the time has come when that trinket you found in Gollum's cave must play its part in the saving or destroying of Middle-earth. But that is a tale for another telling, when the full scope of what we attempt can be revealed. Outside, the wind howled through the bare branches of the party tree, carrying with it the scent of distant storms and the promise of great changes yet to come. Deep beneath the lonely mountain, in chambers carved from living rock by the hands of Durin's folk, the forges of Erebor burned with fires that had not blazed so bright since the days when dwarves wrought weapons for the last alliance. King Dain Ironfoot himself walked among the smiths, his iron-grey beard singed by the heat of the furnaces, his eyes bright with the joy that only a dwarf could feel when steel sang beneath the hammer and precious metals flowed like water. The news from Fangorn had reached Erebor with the swiftness of wind across the mountains, carried by the ravens that served as messengers between the wise. Saruman's war upon the trees had stirred ancient memories in the halls of the dwarves, memories of Khazad-dûm falling to shadow, of the great forest that had once surrounded their mountain homes being hewn down by orc axes and goblin fire. Let the Treebeard and his people know, declared Dain as he watched his smiths forge blade after blade of star steel, that the dwarves of Erebor have not forgotten the old alliances. When the Ents march to war, they shall carry weapons worthy of their courage. Yet even as the forges of the dwarves prepared for war, other fires awakened that boded ill for the free peoples of Middle-earth. In the depths of Mount Doom, where the One Ring had been forged in elder days, the flame that never died began to burn more fiercely. The very mountains shook with the force of its reawakening, and rivers of lava flowed like blood from wounds in the earth. Sauron the Dark Lord felt the stirring of his greatest creation, though the ring itself remained hidden from his sight. Like a beacon in the darkness, it called to its master across the leagues that separated them, and with each day that passed, that call grew stronger. The Nazgûl, those 9 kings who had become wraiths in the service of shadow, began to stir in their tombs of ice and iron, sensing that the time of their greatest service was at hand. In Isengard, Saruman felt the trembling of the earth and knew that his master's power was waxing. The White Wizard stood upon the pinnacle of Orthanc and gazed eastward toward Mordor, his eyes bright with anticipation and dark with fear. The alliance he had made with the Dark Lord was one of convenience, not loyalty, and he harbored hopes of claiming the ring for himself when it was finally revealed. "The fire awakens," he murmured, to the cold wind that swept across his fortress, "and with it all our designs come to fruition. Let the free peoples gather their strength. It will not avail them against the power that returns to the world." Yet Saruman's confidence was not shared by all who served the shadow. In the pits beneath Isengard, where Uruk-hai were bred in darkness and torment, there were those who remembered the defeat at Fangorn's borders. The trees had fought with a fury that surpassed understanding, and even the mightiest Uruks had been broken like twigs in their branches. Word of that defeat had spread among the creatures of darkness, and with it came whispers of doubt. Could the old powers truly be overcome? could steel and fire triumph over root and branch, over the ancient strength that had endured since the world's youth? These questions haunted the dreams of Orc and Uruk alike, for they alone among Saruman's servants had felt the weight of the Ents' wrath. But in Fangorn itself, a different kind of fire was awakening, not the consuming flame of destruction, but the slower, deeper burn of righteous anger. The Huorns walked the forest paths in ever greater numbers, their eyes glowing with inner light as they prepared for the march to war. These were trees that had stood for thousands of years, and their memories stretched back to the days when the world was young and green things covered all the earth. Treebeard stood among his people in the great gathering place of the Entmoot, his ancient voice raised in the slow, deep songs that the tree shepherds used to make important decisions. But this was no ordinary deliberation. This was a call to war, the first such call that had been made since the elder days when shadow first fell upon the world. "Whom, Hom?" rumbled the eldest Ent, his words carrying to every corner of the forest. "The time for hasty action has come at last. Too long have we endured the bite of axe and the scorch of flame. Too long have we watched our people fall while we held to the old ways of peace. The fire awakens in distant Mordor, but let it know that another fire burns here. The fire of trees roused to wrath, of shepherds who will no longer suffer their flocks to be slaughtered." The response that rose from the assembled Ents was like the sound of a forest in storm. Deep voices joining in harmony that shook the very foundations of the earth. Quickbeam, and Bregalad, Leaflock and Fimbrethil, all the great shepherds of Fangorn added their voices to the song of war. And as they sang, the trees themselves began to move, roots tearing free from soil that released them gladly, branches intertwining in formations that spoke of ancient discipline and terrible purpose. The march would begin with the dawn, and when it did, Saruman would learn that there were powers in Middle-earth older and mightier than his engines of war. In the armories of Minas Tirith, where the weapons of Gondor's might lay waiting in halls of white marble, Boromir, son of Denethor, stood before an ancient blade and contemplated the nature of duty. The sword before him was old beyond reckoning, its steel forged in the fires of Numenor when that realm stood proud and fair beneath the light of the two trees. Its name was written in letters of gold upon its pommel: Narcrist, the fire cleaver, blade of kings and bane of shadows. Yet for all its storied past, the sword remained sheathed, its edge untested in the wars that had racked Middle-earth in recent years. Like its bearer, it waited for a conflict worthy of its unleashing, a battle that would determine not merely the fate of kingdoms, but the future of all the free peoples. Boromir was a warrior in his prime, tall and strong, with the bearing of one born to command. His face was stern but not unkind, marked by years of standing watch upon the borders of his land, while darker powers gathered their strength in the east. He was his father's son in all things, proud, loyal, and utterly devoted to the defense of Gondor, yet touched by the same shadow of despair that had begun to cloud the steward's mind. "The Ents march to war," he said to his younger brother Faramir, who stood beside him in the armory. "Word came this morning with the dawn, carried by birds that speak in the ancient tongue. The trees of Fangorn have roused themselves at last to answer Saruman's aggression." Faramir nodded thoughtfully, his grey eyes reflecting the wisdom that had always set him apart from other men. Where Boromir was a warrior first and foremost, Faramir was a scholar soldier, one who understood that battles were won as often by cunning as by strength. "The Ents are mighty," he said, "but can they stand alone against Isengard's walls? Saruman has had years to prepare his defenses, and his Uruks are bred for war." "Perhaps not alone," admitted Boromir, his hand resting upon the hilt of another blade, this one plain and workmanlike, the sword he had carried through a dozen campaigns along Gondor's troubled borders. But the wise gather, and alliances form that may yet surprise our enemies. The dwarves of Erebor forge weapons day and night. The elves of Rivendell and Lorien bestir themselves from their long watching. And even the small folk of the Shire may have a part to play ere all is done. The brothers fell silent then, each lost in thoughts of the trials that lay ahead. In the halls, above them, their father Denethor sat upon the throne of the stewards, his gaze fixed upon the palantir that was his greatest tool and perhaps his greatest curse. The seeing stone showed him visions of the enemy's strength, the vast armies gathering in Mordor, the fires that burned in Mount Doom, the ships of the corsairs that sailed northward from Umbar with black sails spread to catch the wind. Yet for all the stone's power, it could not show Denethor the full scope of the resistance that gathered against the shadow. The palantir was a tool of Sauron's making, and it reflected the Dark Lord's will even as it revealed his secrets. What hope existed in the world was hidden from its sight, veiled by powers older and more subtle than the crude domination that Sauron wielded. In distant Rohan, another blade waited for its hour. Herogrim, the sword of the kings of the Mark, hung at the side of Theoden, son of Thengel, but its weight seemed too great for the king to bear. The old man sat slumped upon his throne, his eyes clouded by the whispers of Wormtongue, his strength sapped by despair and the subtle poison of false counsel. Yet even there, hope was not entirely dead. Eomer, son of Eomund, rode the borders of Rohan with his Eord, striking swiftly at the orc bands that raided out of Isengard. His spear Guthwiner had drunk deep of enemy blood, and his name was spoken with fear in the camps of the Uruks. When the time came for open war, the young marshal of the Riddermark would not be found wanting. In the north, other weapons stirred as their bearers felt the first touch of destiny upon their shoulders. In the halls of the Rangers, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, looked upon Andúril, the flame of the west, and saw in its steel the reflection of a crown that he had never sought, but might yet be called upon to claim. The sword was reforged from the shards of Narsil, the blade that had cut the ring from Sauron's hand in the battles of the last alliance, and its edge thirsted for the chance to complete what was left unfinished. Yet perhaps the most important blade of all remained undrawn, resting in a scabbard that hung at the side of a simple gardener in the Shire. Sting, the knife that Bilbo had named for its eagerness to bite orc flesh, waited patiently for a hand worthy of its wielding. Its bearer knew nothing of its history, or the great deeds it was destined to perform, but the time was coming when even the humblest weapons would be called upon to serve the cause of light. The blades waited, their steel cold but their purpose burning bright. Soon, very soon, they would be drawn in service of the greatest war that Middle-earth had ever known. The march of the Ents began before dawn, when the mist still clung to the valleys of Fangorn and the stars were fading in the lightening sky. It was not the swift advance of cavalry or the measured tread of infantry, but something altogether more terrible: the slow, inexorable movement of the forest itself, as if the very earth had decided to walk to war. Treebeard led the van, his great strides covering leagues with each step, his ancient face set in lines of grim determination. Behind him came the other shepherds of the trees, each mighty in their own right, each burning with the slow fire of awakened wrath. Quickbeam and Bregalad flanked the host like outriders, their rowan red hair streaming in the wind of their passage, while Leaflock brought up the rear, his roots still trailing soil from the grove where he had stood for 7 centuries. But it was the Huorns that made the march truly terrible to behold. They came in their thousands, trees that had awakened to purposes of war, their branches interlaced like shields in a phalanx, their roots moving through the earth like serpents. Oak and ash, elm and beech, all the children of the forest marched together toward Isengard, and the ground trembled beneath their passing. The Uruks who guarded Saruman's outer defenses saw them coming from afar, a wall of green and brown that stretched from horizon to horizon. Some fled in terror, casting aside their weapons and running for the dubious safety of Orthank's walls. Others stood their ground from duty or fear of their master's wrath, but their hands shook as they gripped their blades and their hearts hammered like drums in their chests. For this was not an enemy they had been trained to fight. Their axes could bite through armor and their arrows could pierce mail. But what avail were such weapons against foes whose skin was bark and whose blood was sap? The very earth seemed to rise against them, as roots burst from the ground to entangle their feet, and branches swept down from above to crush them like insects. The siege engines that Saruman had positioned around his fortress, great catapults and ballistae, towers of iron and wheels of war, proved useless against the advancing forest. The Ents simply walked through them, their massive bulk crushing stone and steel alike, while the Huorns swept over the smaller obstacles like a tide over rocks. The very foundations of Isengard shook as the tree host surrounded the ring of stone that had once seemed impregnable. From the pinnacle of Orthanc, Saruman watched the destruction of his outer defenses with eyes that blazed with fury and fear. The White Wizard raised his staff and spoke words of power, calling upon arts learned in the hidden places of the world, but his magic broke like waves against the ancient strength of the Ents. These were beings older than his knowledge, creatures that had walked the earth when the world was young and the music of creation still echoed in the halls of Arda. "You cannot stand against me," cried Saruman, his voice carrying across the battlefield like thunder. "I am Saruman the White, the Ringmaker, the voice of reason. You are but trees, creatures of root and branch, bound to soil and season." It was Treebeard who answered, his voice rolling across Isengard like an avalanche. "We are the shepherds of the forest," he declared, "the guardians of all growing things. You have made war upon our people, White Wizard, and now you shall reap the harvest of your malice." The eldest Ent raised his great hands, and at his signal, the assault began in earnest. The Huorns pressed forward against the walls of Isengard like a living siege engine, their branches finding every crack and crevice, their roots boring deep into the foundations. Stone that had stood for centuries began to crumble, as if the very earth rejected the presence of Saruman's fortress. The Uruks who remained fought with the desperation of the doomed, but they were like gnats before the hurricane of the Ents' wrath. Quickbeam strode among them like a giant from the elder days, his rowan staff sweeping through their ranks like a scythe through wheat. Bregalad's anger burned hotter than forge fire as he avenged his people's suffering, each blow of his mighty fists crushing armor and bone alike. Yet it was not wrath alone that drove the Ents to victory, but something deeper and more enduring, the patient strength of growing things, the power that could split stone with the slow pressure of spreading roots, that could bring down the mightiest walls with the gentle persistence of wind and rain. This was the force that Saruman had challenged when he made war upon the forest, and now it rose against him with all the accumulated fury of ages. The gates of Isengard, wrought of iron and reinforced with bands of steel, buckled and broke before the advance of the tree host. The Huorns flowed through the breach like a green tide, their branches reaching out to grasp and crush any who stood in their path. The fortress that had taken decades to build was reduced to rubble in a single day, its walls torn down and its towers cast into ruin. Only Orthanc itself remained standing, its smooth walls proof against even the Ents' assault. But the tower was now an island in a sea of destruction, its foundations undermined and its approaches choked with the wreckage of Saruman's pride. The White Wizard was trapped like a rat in his own stronghold, master now of nothing but empty stone and bitter regret. The kingdom of Isengard was reclaimed, not by armies of men or the cavalry of Rohan, but by the oldest power in Middle-earth, the strength of the trees themselves, roused at last to righteous war. In the deep places of the Shire, where the roots of the old forest ran beneath hill and dale, something stirred that had lain quiet for many long years. It was not a thing of evil, yet neither was it entirely of good. Rather, it was a power that existed beyond such simple distinctions, ancient as the bones of the earth and patient as the growth of mountains. Old Man Willow felt it first, that ancient tree whose malice was legend among the hobbits of Buckland. His roots ran deeper than any other in the old forest, and through them he sensed the awakening of forces that had slumbered since the elder days. The ring was moving, though its bearer knew not what burden he carried, and its stirring sent ripples through all the hidden powers of Middle-earth. Yet the ring itself remained quiescent, bound by enchantments that its maker had woven into its very substance. It would not reveal its true nature while its bearer remained in innocence, would not call to its master while carried by one who used its power only for small magics and harmless tricks. This was perhaps the greatest irony of all, that the most dangerous artifact in Middle-earth lay hidden in the pocket of a hobbit who thought it nothing more than a curious bauble. Tom Bombadil, master of the old forest and eldest of all things that walked Middle-earth, sang to himself as he tended his garden in the depths of the Withywindle Valley. His voice was like the sound of running water over smooth stones, older than memory, yet bright with eternal youth. He alone in all the world knew the true nature of the ring, had held it in his hands and found it wanting of his attention. "Hey doll, merry doll, ring a dong dillo," sang Tom as he worked among his flowers, but beneath the lightness of his words lay depths of knowledge that would have amazed even the wise. He knew of the war that raged around Isengard, of the Ents who marched in their fury, and the trees that walked to battle. More than that, he knew of the choice that lay before a certain young hobbit in Bag End, though that choice remained hidden even from Gandalf's sight. In Rivendell, where the last homely house stood as a haven of peace in a world grown dark with war, Elrond half-elven walked in his gardens and pondered the nature of the burden that must soon be revealed. The Lord of Rivendell possessed one of the three rings of the elves, and through Vilya he could sense the stirring of powers that had long lain dormant. The One Ring was wakening to its purpose, and with it all the lesser rings would be brought into subjection to its will. "The time draws near," he murmured to Glorfindel, who walked beside him beneath the malon trees that grew in remembrance of far Lorien. "Soon the ring-bearer must be revealed, and the choice that shapes all choices must be made. Yet I fear that when that hour comes, the wisdom of the wise will prove insufficient to the task." Glorfindel nodded gravely, his golden hair bright in the starlight that filtered through the leaves. The Lord of the Golden Flower had died once in the service of his people, and been granted return to Middle-earth for purposes that were yet unfulfilled. His death and rebirth had given him sight beyond that of ordinary elves, and he too could sense the gathering of great forces around the hidden ring. "Perhaps," said Glorfindel, "wisdom was never meant to carry this burden. Perhaps it must fall to those who act not from knowledge, but from love, not from understanding, but from simple courage. The small hands, as Gandalf is fond of, saying, that shape the greatest fates." In Lorien, where the golden malon trees grew tall and fair beneath the protection of Galadriel's ring, the Lady of the Wood gazed into her mirror and saw visions of what might be. The water showed her many things: the march of the Ents, the fall of Isengard, the gathering storm that would soon break upon all the lands of Middle-earth. But one vision troubled her above all others: a small figure walking alone through darkness, bearing a burden that grew heavier with each step. "The ring-bearer is chosen," she whispered to herself, her voice like wind through silver leaves, "though he knows it not. Soon he must take up the burden that will either save or damn us all, and we who are wise must watch and aid as we may, though the path he walks is one that none can share." Yet still, the ring slept in its golden slumber, waiting for the hour when innocence would be stripped away and its true nature revealed. It dreamed, perhaps, of the dark tower where it was forged, of the hand that shaped it and the will that drove its creation. But those dreams were distant things, shadows cast by fires that burned far away. And for now, the ring remained what its bearer believed it to be: a simple treasure, remarkable only for its power to make him vanish from unwelcome visitors. The great game was in motion, the pieces moving toward their destined places, but the most important piece of all remained unaware of its role. Soon, very soon, that ignorance would be stripped away, and the true war for Middle-earth would begin in earnest. The breaking of Isengard came not with the thunder of siege engines or the clash of armies, but with the quiet sound of roots growing through stone and the gentle pressure of branches against unyielding walls. For 7 days and 7 nights the Ents and Horns maintained their siege, not seeking to storm the walls by force, but slowly, patiently undermining the very foundations upon which Saruman's power rested. On the morning of the 8th day, as the sun rose red through the smoke that still hung over the ruins of the outer defenses, a horn sounded from the pinnacle of Orthanc. It was not the harsh brazen note of war, but something more subtle, a call for parley, the first admission that even the proud Saruman could make that his position had become untenable. Treebeard approached the base of the tower with slow, measured steps, his ancient face grave as carved stone. Behind him came the other shepherds of the trees, while the Hjorns formed a living wall that encircled Orthanc completely. No force in Middle-earth, save the Ents themselves, could have broken through that barrier, and Saruman knew it. "Whom, harm," rumbled Treebeard as he gazed up at the smooth walls of the tower. "Come down, Saruman the White. Come down and face the judgment of those you have wronged." The voice that answered came from high above, floating down from the topmost window of Orthanc, where a figure in white robes could be seen silhouetted against the sky. Even now, trapped and defeated, Saruman's voice retained its power to move hearts and cloud minds, but the Ents had grown wise to such tricks through long experience of the wizard's treachery. "What would you have of me, tree shepherd?" called Saruman, and though his words were calm, those with keen hearing could detect the note of desperation that lay beneath them. "I have committed no crime save that of seeking order in a world grown chaotic. The trees that fell beneath my axes were put to noble purpose, the forging of tools and weapons needed for the defense of the West." Defense? The word rumbled from Treebeard's throat like distant thunder. "You speak of defense while you breed uruks in the darkness beneath your tower. You speak of order while you ally yourself with the enemy of all that lives and grows. Your words are fair, Saruman Destroyer, but your deeds give them the lie." It was then that another voice joined the parley, lighter than the Ents' deep tones but carrying no less authority. Gandalf the White emerged from among the Hjorns, his staff gleaming like a star in the morning light, his robes unmarked by the ash and dust that lay thick upon the ruined fortress. "The time for words is past, Saruman," said the wizard, his grey eyes fixed upon the figure in the tower. "You have made your choice, aligned yourself with powers that seek only destruction. Now you must face the consequences of that alliance." A laugh came from above, bitter and proud. "You speak to me of consequences, Gandalf the Grey? Or should I say Gandalf the White, for I see you have stolen the title that was rightfully mine. You know nothing of the forces that move in this world, nothing of the power that rises in the east. I sought only to preserve what could be preserved, to find a place for wisdom in the coming darkness. By destroying those who had never done you harm." The voice that spoke was young and clear, and it came from a direction that none had expected. Quick-beamed the Ent stepped forward, his rowan red hair blazing in the sunlight, his eyes bright with the fire of youth and righteous anger. My trees lie burning in your furnaces, ancient ones who had stood since the world's youth. They offered you no threat, sought no quarrel with your purposes, yet you cut them down for naught but fuel for your engines of war. For the first time, Saruman's voice faltered, and when he spoke again, the old certainty was gone. The needs of war, sacrifices must be made. You do not understand the greater picture. I understand enough, said Treebeard with finality. You have shown your true nature, Saruman of many colors, and we have seen it for what it is. The judgment of the Ents is this: you shall remain in your tower, master of naught but stone and emptiness, until the world changes and all your works are forgotten. As if in response to the Ents' words, the Huorns began to close their ranks around Orthanc. They pressed against the tower's base, not with violence, but with the inexorable pressure of growing things, their roots finding every crack and seam, their branches interweaving until the tower stood in the heart of an impenetrable forest. No creature could enter or leave that place without the Ents' permission, and that permission would not be lightly granted. But even as Saruman was thus imprisoned, his influence was not entirely ended. Across Middle-earth, the forces he had set in motion continued their work. The Uruks he had bred still raided from hidden strongholds. The alliances he had forged with the servants of Shadow still held firm, and the weapons he had crafted still lay in armories waiting to be used. Moreover, Saruman himself was far from powerless even in defeat. The arts he had learned in his long study of the ring lore were not so easily confined, and his voice could still reach those who were willing to listen. From his prison in Orthanc, he began to weave new plots, to whisper new corruptions into willing ears, to plant seeds of discord that might yet bear bitter fruit. The enemy had withdrawn, but he had not surrendered. The war for Middle-earth was far from over, and Saruman's greatest weapon, the corruption of hope itself, remained unbroken. The victory at Isengard was complete, but it felt hollow in the hearts of those who witnessed its aftermath. Where once the great fortress had stood in terrible majesty, now lay only rubble and ruin, the broken stones scattered like bones across a field of ash. The very earth seemed poisoned by the works that had been wrought there, blackened and barren, reluctant to welcome the touch of growing things. Treebeard walked among the ruins with slow, heavy steps, his ancient eyes taking in the full scope of the desolation that Saruman's ambitions had wrought. Here had stood groves of oak and ash, elm and beech, trees that had grown for centuries in the shadow of the mountains. Now there was nothing but stumps and charcoal, the remnants of lives cut short in the service of industry and war. Hom, rumbled the eldest Ent, his voice heavy with a sorrow that ran deeper than the roots of mountains. Too late we came to save them. Too late our anger burned bright enough to matter. The trees are fallen, and no song of ours can give them back their life. Yet even in the midst of such desolation, hope persisted. From the scorched earth around the ruins, new shoots were already beginning to emerge. Not the carefully planned plantations that men might have sown, but wild growth, free and untamed. Oak saplings thrust their leaves toward the sun with defiant joy, while Malorn seedlings from distant Lorien caught root in soil that had known only corruption for too many years. Gandalf stood beside the Ent, his white robes untouched by the ash that swirled around them in the morning breeze. The wizard's eyes held depths of knowledge that spoke of ages beyond counting, yet in them too was a flicker of the same hope that drove the young trees to reach for light. "Not too late," said the wizard gently. "Changed, perhaps, different from what came before, but not too late for new growth, new life, new chances for the world to heal itself. The trees that died here were not destroyed. They are transformed, become part of the earth that will nourish their children." It was a small comfort, perhaps, but comfort nonetheless. The Ents began the long work of tending the wounded land, their great hands gentle as they encouraged the new growth and cleared away the debris of Saruman's reign. It would be long years before Isengard was green again, decades before the scars were fully healed, but the work had begun. Word came from the outside world as the Ents labored, carried by birds and beasts that had fled the fury of the siege and now returned to reclaim their ancient territories. The war was spreading, they reported. Sauron's armies were on the march from Mordor. The Nazgul rode the wind on fell beasts, and the shadow of Mount Doom stretched ever longer across the lands of the West. Yet there was hope in those tidings as well. The Free Peoples were gathering in response to the threat, setting aside old grudges and forgotten quarrels to stand together against the darkness. The dwarves of Erebor marched south with weapons bright as starlight. The elves of Rivendell and Lorien prepared for war with the terrible beauty of their ancient wrath. And even the small folk of the Shire were stirring to purposes greater than any they had known before. "The great test comes," said Gandalf as he prepared to depart Fangorn, his errand there completed and greater tasks awaiting elsewhere. "All that we have worked for, all that we have hoped for, will be decided in the days ahead. Yet I find myself strangely hopeful, for I have seen what the smallest hands can accomplish when they are moved by love rather than ambition." Treebeard nodded slowly, his ancient wisdom recognizing the truth in the wizard's words. "The small folk," he agreed. "They have courage we giants lack, hearts that do not harden with the passage of ages. If hope is to be found anywhere, it will be in their gardens and their hearths, their simple joys and quiet sorrows." As if summoned by their words, a small company appeared at the edge of the ruined lands, hobbits from the Shire, led by one whose bearing spoke of hidden strength and untested courage. Frodo Baggins had come to Rivendell bearing a burden that would change the fate of all Middle-earth, though he did not yet understand the full weight of what he carried. The ring had awakened at last, its dreams of power and dominion stirring in response to its maker's growing strength. Soon, the final battle would begin, not on the fields where armies clashed, but in the hidden places of the heart where hope and despair warred for mastery of the soul. Yet for now, in this moment of quiet before the storm, there was peace in Fangorn. The Ents tended their wounded forest with patience born of ages, while overhead the stars wheeled in their courses and the wind carried the scent of growing things. Tomorrow would bring new sorrows and new challenges, but tonight there was hope in the ashes, and that was enough. In the west, the lights of the Shire twinkled like earthbound stars, a reminder that not all the world was given over to shadow and fear. There, in gardens bright with flowers and kitchens warm with firelight, the true strength of Middle-earth rested, not in the might of arms or the wisdom of the ancient, but in the stubborn love of small folk for the simple things that made life worth living. The Ents sang as they worked, their deep voices joining in harmonies that had not been heard since the music of creation first rang through the halls of Arda. It was a song of endings and beginnings, of sorrows past and joys yet to come, of hope that persisted even in the darkest hour. And in that song, the trees began to dance. Thus ends this tale of the awakening of the Ents, though their story continues in the greater symphony of the War of the Ring. In gardens small and grand, the hope of Middle-earth took root, and from those roots would grow the strength to challenge the darkness that sought to cover all the world in shadow.